God our Maker, in summer we easily marvel at the world you have made, the colors of sunrise and sunset filling the horizon, the intricate beauty of flower gardens and national parks, the quiet dignity of a river in its course, and the steadfast presence of a rock face carved over time. You show us how each small piece of your creation depends in many ways on all the others. Summer growth depends on spring rains. Health for each creature depends on the wise balance you have set between each species. The quality of life on the respect we show one another. Wise and patient God, we marvel at the world you love. Our worship joins the song of all creation to bring you praise, honoring you and the relationships you have set between us all through Christ, firstborn of all creation. Amen. Once upon a time there lived a young prince. When his father died, he assumed his divinely appointed throne, married a beautiful princess from a neighboring kingdom, and settled down to govern his people. Soon afterwards, God appeared to him in a dream and promised to grant the young royal whatever his heart desired. Being a humble man, the new king refused to ask for wealth, power, or long life, and instead replied, "I am only a child. Therefore, give your servant an understanding, a mind to govern your people and to discern between good and evil." God was so pleased with the king's request, and he promised not only to grant it, to make the king the wisest human being in history, but to grant him every other measure of greatness as well: untold wealth, matchless honor, and long life. In time, the king's reputation for brilliance spread across the land. Nobles traveled from distant shores to hear his wise words and witness his wise judgments. Following his wisdom and God's blessing, the king's wealth and power grew beyond measure. He made strategic, political, and economic alliances, maintained fleets of ships, built gorgeous temples and palaces, traded in luxuries such as gold, silver, and ivory, penned the greatest wisdom literature of his time, presided over the golden age of his kingdom, and finally handed his throne to his son after a peaceful reign of 40 years. This is the version of King Solomon's story I learned growing up. It was the stuff of fable and fairy tale all mashed up, but it wasn't the whole truth. Here is another version of the same story. Once upon a time there lived a young prince. When his father died, he ordered the murder of his older brother, the rightful heir to the throne, and took over the kingdom by stealth and bloodshed. After spending the early days of his reign carrying out the vengeance killings his father had requested, he set out to build the kingdom of his dreams, an empire of wealth, prestige, and power. The king's appetites were beyond excessive. To satisfy his lusts, he assembled a harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines. To support his extravagant lifestyle, he levied taxes his subjects couldn't bear. To police knowledge, he gathered the surrounding world's wisdom traditions to himself. To complete his lavish building projects, he drafted thousands of people into forced labor. He constructed pagan shrines and offered worship to gods who demanded child sacrifice to quell his spiritual restlessness. By the end of his reign, his people could no longer bear the crushing burdens of taxation and slavery he had placed upon them. In the wake of his paganism, they could no longer differentiate between idolatry and worship. The king soon found himself confronted by enemies. After his untimely death, his son tried to force the disgruntled masses back into servitude, but a civil war that would last for decades broke out across the land when they resisted. The kingdom split in two, and the famed king's once golden dreams dissolved into chaos. One king, two stories. Which story tells the truth about Solomon, about us? The Solomon of the Bible is a human being. which is to say, he is, like us, a paradox, blessed with wisdom and cursed with foolishness, devoted to God and attracted to idols, committed to his intellect and shackled to his appetites. In other words, we can neither whitewash nor dismiss this king. His story is too familiar and too much like our own. But we can learn from it. If we are willing to look at his life in its full complexity, he has much to teach us. Here are a few lessons I've carried away from his story. To hunger for wisdom is the beginning of wisdom. Despite Solomon's many mistakes, he got this much right. He asked God for understanding, discernment, and sound judgment. In asking for these things, he was, at least for a time, aware that he was not God. He recognized that he was small, weak, imperfect, and prone to error. Knowing where he stood in the hierarchy of things, he cultivated what the psalmist called the fear of the Lord. Not fear as in terror, but fear as in awe and radical amazement at who God is in relation to humanity. The beginning of wisdom is hunger, yearning, longing. The beginning of wisdom is the humble willingness to ask for what we need. It's possible to lose God's dream in ours. Solomon may very well have received a vision from God. It doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that Solomon's own dreams very quickly took center stage. Walter Brueggemann puts it this way: the wisdom that Solomon does not learn is attentiveness to those for whom God has special attentiveness. There are all kinds of dreams of power and money and prestige and control, but the dream of justice for widows, orphans, and immigrants is the deep wisdom of Torah obedience. And that's the dream, God's dream for the least and most vulnerable of his children, that Solomon never fulfills. Solomon believed that his wisdom and his legitimacy as Israel's ruler came from himself. But how often in the years that followed did he return to that original mandate and ask himself if his reign was still worthy of God's stamp of approval? Let's tell the story one more time. Once upon a time there lived a king. He had big dreams, as most of us do. He had many faults, as most of us do. He yearned at times for the best of things, wisdom, discernment, and a sound mind, and lusted at other times for the worst. He lived a life marked by success and failure, nobility and disgrace. He loved God, and he didn't. He pleased God, and he didn't. He left a legacy that was not perfect, as most of us will. But he was loved by God throughout, even when his foolish wisdom shattered God's heart. And so are we. Amen.